And the topic is looking at the growth of the global LNG sector through innovative partnerships and cooperation. We've heard this week about the global demand for LNG skyrocketing and meeting the world's growing energy needs while transitioning to a low-carbon economy. And to really get there, we know that companies, including pretty much all the companies here at the conference this week, are really focused on multi-stakeholder strategic partnerships to ensure that the LNG industry continues to grow and to meet that energy trilemma that Madam Lee discussed. We know that LNG projects can create and sustain employment, improve productivity and competitiveness, and benefit consumers who are seeking a cleaner source of energy in the long term. So our discussion today with a very distinguished panel of industry leaders is going to really come down to looking at what are the opportunities for creating innovative partnerships and effective cooperation going forward. So as I walk over here, I'm going to invite our panelists to join me, starting first with the Honourable Minister Stuart Young, who is the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries from the country of Trinidad and Tobago. Minister Young. Thank you. Thanks, Minister. The next, we have Paul Marsden, who is the President for the Energy Division of Bechtel Energy. Paul, please welcome Paul. Thank you. Next, we have François Poirier, who is the President and CEO of TC Energy. Please welcome François. And last but not least, we have Cederic Cremers, who is the Executive Vice President for the LNG group at Shell. Thank you, Cedric. Thank you. All right, good. Well, as we've been doing with the other sessions, before we get into the question and answer, I want to thank everyone for making the trip to Vancouver and being part of our conference. But also just want everybody to briefly introduce themselves. Of course, you've all seen their bios, but maybe just a quick word of introduction about your backgrounds briefly, starting with you, Minister Young.
Good morning. Thanks a lot. I was reflecting this morning on the perspective that I can bring to this panel of esteemed gentlemen who are all executives in private sector. And the perspective I'll bring is from a small twin island state. We're only about 1,900 square miles of land mass, but we have an LNG facility, Atlantic LNG, that on 2 occasions when we built Train 1 decades ago, it was the largest facility in the Western Hemisphere, and then when we built Train 4 many moons ago as well, it was the largest, one of the largest trains in the world. So small Trinidad and Tobago has been in the LNG business for a few decades right now, and we're going through a transition period that is a bit of a forced transition because we've been exploiting our gas resources for decades now, and we've built up quite a sophisticated gas sector in Trinidad. So as our natural resource of gas depletes in Trinidad, how do we find additional gas resources? How do we continue to feed our LNG facility? And the perspective I'm hoping to bring here this morning is from a government perspective. So I was listening to some of the pre-conversation this morning, and one of the comments that was being made is, you can't be everything to everyone. Unfortunately, when you're in a government role and as an elected member, that is something you're beaten over the head with consistently. So from a government perspective is how do we balance it? How do we work with private sector individuals like we have here right now? Shell and BP are 2 of the largest shareholders of our LNG facility in Trinidad, with government holding a position as well. And we've spent the last 4 years negotiating and restructuring our LNG. So that's the perspective we'll bring. From a government perspective, I can tell you, it's a lot more balancing to make sure you get the right returns for the people of your country, but also to make sure we keep private sector involved because we need the capital and the expertise. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. I think there'll be a lot of interest in hearing your perspective from Trinidad and Tobago. Paul, an introduction from you.
Yes, as we've been preparing for this panel, Bechtel is celebrating its 125th anniversary this year, and I know my colleagues are here on the stage. Bechtel built Atlantic LNG, all the phases of it. We've done a huge amount of time building many of the pipeline networks over over North America, and in the 27 years that I've worked for Bechtel, 18 of them have been working on Shell projects. So the perspective I think we want to bring today is talking about people, talking about partnerships, and the strength that that brings of togetherness in developing the infrastructure of the future, while really still focusing on the more of everything, which is what we're going to need today to satiate the thirst for energy that certainly has come to the forefront over the last several years. So really looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Francois.
Well, TC Energy has its roots in natural gas transmission from the Western Canadian Basin, and the company was formed about 70 years ago. Today, we've expanded our footprint to natural gas transmission across all three countries of Canada, United States, and Mexico. We transport about 25% of the natural gas around the continent. In the United States, we supply today about 30% of the feed gas to US LNG facilities, and plan on doubling our supply of feed gas from 3 BCF a day to about 6 BCF a day by the end of the decade. So it's looking at the trends over the last 35 years. I've been involved in the natural gas transmission industry. The skills that are required to manage through issues have evolved. Over the last 10 years, and even over the last 5 years, they've evolved dramatically. And as the challenges that we have are all united in looking to address have become much more complex. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Francois. Cederic.
Thanks, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think particularly this topic of partnership to sit next to three great partners of ours. I think with the Honourable Minister, Minister Young, you said you can't be everything to everyone. I'll make a slight joke. I said, I think you are everything to everybody. Often we sometimes refer to the Minister as the Minister of Everything because of the critical role he plays of meeting the interests of the country in Trinidad, but also working with the industry to achieve what the world needs in terms of a reliable supply of energy. I think a huge journey we've been on, together with our partners there and with the state of Trinidad around finding new gas supply to keep the plant full, and also doing that in a regional context right now. Paul, I think I can say without a doubt that you know my plants better than I do around the world and the assets, and know them in and out. And Francois, I think probably the most exciting, project that we have right now is the one here in British Columbia, working with the 5 partners across LNG Canada, with all of the contractors making it possible, the communities, the government, most importantly also the First Nation support, and of course the CGL pipeline that will make sure that gas gets to the shore here from across 2 mountain ranges, and huge undertaking. And so I think I couldn't be more pleased here, Robert, to be here to talk about partnership and to discuss together how do we really, meet those great challenges and that energy trilemma that Madam Lee talked about earlier, because I think that's the exciting challenge in a way as well that we have ahead of us to solve as an industry in the years ahead.
Definitely exciting. No one would say that this is a boring industry these days with everything that we face. I think we have a lot to talk about. I heard you gentlemen use a couple terms, right? You talked a lot about the partnerships that you have with each other across the industry and across the value chain. And of course, we've got project developers represented here in super majors. We've got midstream and transmission. We've got EP&C. We've got government. So we've got a pretty good, not the entire value chain, but a pretty good slice of it here to talk about. So you use the term partnerships. We also talked a lot about words like change and transition and adaptation, whether forced or deliberate, as you said, Minister. And I think that's where we want to start the conversation today, thinking about the idea of the evolution in the business model, right, and where the innovation is happening, the business model for your companies, and of course for Trinidad and Tobago as a country. So Minister, I'll start with you. You kind of described Trinidad and Tobago as part of the global gas business, been there for decades. How is the business model of kind of Trinidad and Tobago, Inc. evolving in the face of this low-carbon transition?
Like everyone who's involved in the gas business, in a very volatile time, we've had to transition. Fortunately, we have some world-class partners. One is sitting right here with us, and as we heard, Bechtel built it. But with Shell, the BP, the EOGs, the Woodsides of the world, what we've had to do is really listen as a government and find ways to move us forward and to make sure that we continue to be globally competitive in our gas business, whilst we're doing more exploration. So right now in Trinidad, we've entered into the deep water phase of exploration, and we're doing that with Woodside. With Shell, we're doing some very good dancing around geopolitics, because right next door to us, to be blunt, is Venezuela with some of the largest resources in the world. And in 2018, we had negotiated a commercial term sheet to bring Venezuelan gas to market in Trinidad. You then had sanctions brought on later on. So we're going through that motion of being able to maneuver to get cross-border gas into Trinidad, which by itself is a massive task. But we've managed to pursue a field that is on both sides with Shell, and we're bringing that to market in the meantime, the Manatee field. So these are just some of the difficulties that we're facing, and we have to face to keep our business going, but we're doing it. And then at the same time, you're looking at the conversations of the transition, the CCUS. We're looking to start our first green hydrogen pilot project within the next couple of years, because we're the largest exporter of ammonia. I know it's all about LNG at this conference, but we have many, many derivatives coming out of our gas. So it is, how do we continue to be globally attractive for the capital that is being spent by some of these companies, and keep the plants, because we're the only place where we have immediate capacity in Trinidad, in particular in LNG, and you're looking at the rest of the world screaming for more LNG, and we're right next to proven reserves. So once we get access to the proven reserves, whilst we're developing what is available domestically, we'll get it. And I'll end just the last part by saying a plug I've been making. If we in the region, we now have Guyana and Suriname as well with hydrocarbon resources, join together and we work with Latin America, there is a lot of efficiency that can be had there to provide energy security, not only for our region, but we'd like to think globally, because we'll provide more product to the market. So those are some of the things taking place. And as a government, is how do you stay nimble? How do you stay attentive and the decision making that you have to do to keep yourself competitive?
Well, Minister, if I can follow up with you, I think I heard you say that you're obviously investing in different forms of innovation, like green hydrogen and things like that, CCUS. But you talked about the need to bring on more supply, the deep water, the partnerships with Guyana and Suriname, et cetera, resolving the Venezuela issues. So it sounds like you're not that worried about demand in the energy transition. It sounds like, from your perspective, even though we're going to energy transition, you still think there'll be a lot of gas demand for your country.
I've heard the phrase that is being splashed across quite a lot at this conference. It is not about transition, it's about destination, and that's what we've believed. And I'm happy to hear the world now waking up to it and advocating it. I heard Meg O'Neill yesterday say that we have to be the advocates for gas. I'm a strong, strong believer for that. Because it's very easy for certain people out there in the world who have no responsibility to take positions and say, you have to shut down the hydrocarbon economy. Start with the coal. That's the worst emitter. But gas is here to stay. Gas is going to be here way beyond 2050. You have to have a balance in providing energy security, and in particular power generation. Renewables are not going to do it alone. So yes, I believe the demand is going to be here for decades, and it is how does Trinidad and Tobago continue to supply that demand whilst utilizing, part of the conversation was technology to clean up, to decarbonize, to find ways to reduce emissions and make cleaner products.
Great, thanks, Minister. Paul, let me turn to you. Again, the theme here is thinking about innovation, the business model. You mentioned, I think you said Bechtel, 127 years?
125.
125, there you go. So that you've obviously, the business model has evolved a lot over time, but what's happening today? How is the business model evolving at Bechtel in the face of the energy transition?
So I think it's interesting to also talk about what are some of the things that have stayed the same and are going to stay the same in the future. You know, I know I talk on behalf of all the EPC service providers. You know, that we all do our best work when we get involved early in the concept development, in shaping and developing. You know, what is the asset going to physically look like? What is it going to produce? How are we going to build it? Where are we going to build it? Where are we going to buy it? Because the reality is, even if you look back at just some of the LNG projects that I've done together with Shell, with proven reserves in the ground, marketable gas, 10 years from concept development to an operational plant, That's really quick. And that's for a highly marketable product that is in massive demand today. So if you think about the future state and the energy transition, which has more marginal economics, we have supply chains for the commodities that we're going to be producing that are not yet mature. They are rewiring themselves as we speak. The reality is, you're talking decades to develop some of these major concepts, but it still starts from the basic things of what's it going to look like, how are we going to build it, where are we going to buy it, who are we going to go build it with. A lot of that stays the same, and it's been constant for all 125 years of our history. It's never changed. It still requires hands and minds and teams and people and cranes. Today maybe we use trucks and not horses. I certainly get that. Right. But a lot of the real basics of how we develop and build large capital projects remains the same. What's changing is they're getting bigger, they're getting harder, and with the demand that we have on energy, and like I said in my opening comments, the need for more of what we know, in addition to developing the new technologies which are going to get us to the future state of our energy in outside probably all of our lifetimes. We've got a lot to do in that time, but it all starts with partnerships, working together, early development, really pushing technology. Just in the conference this week, we've been having lots of discussions with a lot of the major equipment providers. And if you look at the turbo machinery that was available 10, 15 years ago, which is still in the market today, and the modern aeroderivative machinery, for the same power, there's 30% reduction in emissions. It's amazing what technology has done, and we've got to unleash the human capital and the people to continue to push that, because that's what we're going to need.
So when you think about this business model question, and you talked about large capital projects, is the mix starting to change, that you're starting to see that expertise applied not just to LNG, but now you're starting to see the hydrogen and CCUS projects start to emerge, and what does that mean for your business? What's that transition look like?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about all that is, of course, LNG is it's so proven. The technologies, there's multiple of them, they're very mature, they're all at market. So for an EPC contractor, we can get ourselves fundamentally comfortable with the guarantees and the like that are required to bring a project forward to sanction. The new world with newer energies, maybe not necessarily new technologies, but new stringing together of individual technologies, which takes a source to a final product that are more unproven. They're a little bit more challenging for all of us to take on. Right. Nobody's particularly scared about serial number 2 or 3, but we all tremble in our boots a little bit about serial number 1. But that's one of the things. It is all coming together to figure out how to go do that. Because with the right time, the right people, the right effort, the right leadership, we can figure out how to get it right. Rushing our way through it, which I personally feel that we were, in 2020 and 2021 when the pendulum really swung. We're not ready for it today, but we need to be ready for it tomorrow, and we need to have the time to be able to go figure this stuff out, working together with technology providers, with major customers, governments, all of the stakeholders are going to make these things become a reality. LNG was new 50 years ago too. Right. And that's the amount of time it's taken to become something which has become a mature market, and history has a little bit of a tendency to repeat itself.
Yeah. Well, and governments were important at the sort of conception of the LNG business, and they'll probably be important at the conception of the new low-carbon business as well. Thanks, Paul. So, Francois, thinking about TC Energy and the evolving business model there, obviously been through a rebrand in the name. You mentioned in the U.S. and Mexico and sort of a North American-focused business, which kind of reflects the fact that gas has become more global. Yes. Tell us a little bit more about that, how you manage that change, as well as this low-carbon transition. Those are two kind of parallel challenges.
Yes. Well, I think pipelines have been the recipient of the challenge around permitting and rights of way, because we develop our infrastructure over hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers, which means that we have to engage with communities, policymakers in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, which makes it that much more challenging. But I would say that on the whole, looking at my 35 years in developing energy infrastructure, certainly over the last decade, the challenges and the skills and the processes that we undertake and then the amount of collaboration we need to ensue with our partners and our customers has increased dramatically. In the old days, if you were good at engineering and construction and you could raise money at an efficient cost of capital, you would be successful. But as we all know, uncertainty is the enemy of investment. Right. And as permitting has become more challenging, particularly over the multiple jurisdictions that midstream infrastructure has to manage through, as policy has become more volatile, and as you mentioned, we're in 3 countries with 3 different approaches to policy, 3 different regulatory regimes. We have to learn to manage through each of those, which means you need to develop competencies in influencing policy, in influencing regulation, and then operating within the guidelines of the different jurisdictions. It also underscores the importance of collaboration with our customers, and we've been collaborating very closely with LNG Canada because policymakers and regulators, to a great extent, don't differentiate in the ecosystem around an LNG project. There's a liquefaction facility and there's a pipeline. They view them as a single effort, if you will, which means that we need to work very closely with our customers to make sure that the degree of engagement we're undertaking with Indigenous rights holders and with policymakers is very closely coordinated, is consistent, and frankly, the degree of engagement that is required has increased dramatically, and our investment in those types of capabilities has increased dramatically over the last 5 years or so to reflect our need to be able to manage cost, schedule, and ensure that there's a continued flow of cost-efficient capital to allow us to build our infrastructure.
Thank you, Francois. It's very helpful. Cederic, let me turn to you. Again, thinking about evolving business models, Shell's very front and center as a global leader across sort of the whole energy value chain. The low-carbon business has become more and more important, not just your company, but your other peer super majors. Within that, how is Shell thinking about LNG and the energy transition?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Maybe just to step back one step first, and think about what's happened in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what's that created in the energy markets. Just to realize that the amount of energy supply that went out of the market's about 1% of global capacity. And just see what that did to global markets and to livelihoods, around the world in places not just in Europe, but across the entire world. Countries like Pakistan that couldn't afford to pay electricity to keep schools open 5 days a week. Right? These are the kind of impacts of a 1% reduction in global supply. And I think that's really, just shows how important the energy trilemma is, and those 3 elements together of energy security, energy affordability, as well as sustainability of energy. Now, to your specific point, I think the biggest mistake we could make as an industry right now is to say, okay, well then it's all about security and affordability. Right. I do think that this is the time also in the industry to double down on the sustainability and continue to work on that going forward, as the minister and as Paul have reflected as well. Now, I think, I completely agree with the minister that gas is a destination business through the energy transition and at the end of the energy transition. But I think that's partially because we need to change our frame of mind about what the gas business is. And it's LNG today, and it's pipeline gas and methane, and it will be for a long period of time. But also, over time, it will more and more become other lower carbon gases, whether it's a combination of using CCS in that, whether it's hydrogen, ammonia that the minister mentioned, or whether it's even synthetic gases. And I think all of that together is actually what I see as the gas business, which is here today, and it's dominated by methane and LNG, and it will be for a long time, but it encompasses that whole business into the future. And we need to invest in all of those things, because I think all of those solutions will be needed One of the partners in our business, which is not represented right here, is our customer base. And actually in working with them and understanding their challenges around what they need the products for, what their infrastructure challenges in different countries are, you actually come to see is that in some places actually an ammonia solution has a very good fit. That in other places it's hydrogen, but in third places, because of the huge cost of infrastructure change that it might mean that actually a synthetic gas is actually the right thing to do. So I think all of these things will be needed. We do need to continue to invest in them, but I will just say also is we cannot just rely on that because products like traditional methane and oil will be here for a long period of time, and we need to invest in decarbonizing those, like the minister said. Just to share two numbers, Robert, if we take 2016 as a baseline, we set the target to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions as a company by 50% by 2030. At the end of 2022, we had already met minus 30%. So we're over halfway there after the first 6 years. Now, in the next 8 years, quite confident that we'll make that next 20% to reach that 50% target.
Well, you're talking a lot about sort of the flexible business model, which has been a key theme, I think, in the conference this week. In flexible in a couple of senses. One is maintaining balance between affordability, energy security, and sustainability. And the second is, as you said, the potential evolution of gas as a product. And I'm a little bit curious, not to steal the thunder from the next panel, but from a technology perspective, the sort of legacy LNG assets that you have and pipeline gas assets that you have, can they transition to be RNG or hydrogen or syngas, or are we talking about new infrastructure, right? Because I think that's a lot of questions that we're getting is, how will today's infrastructure be suited to meet these new fuels we're talking about for the future that might be more sustainable?
Yeah. Robert, I think of that in three parts. First of all, I do think we need to, make optimal use of the infrastructure that we have in the world today.
Right.
Because sometimes in these conferences we get all excited about, kind of new projects that are being built and new things. Sorry, Paul, I know that's important for you guys, but we do have a lot of capacity that's not being fully utilized around the world, and actually investing more also in gas supply in order to, fill those plants that we have around the world. One, because it's the quickest way to get the product to the market and to address that challenge of energy security, but also very importantly, I think as anybody can kind of logically consider, it is the lowest carbon way to get more product to the market as well, as opposed to building completely new LNG plants, for example. The second one is and this is not an easy challenge, and if I think about partnership and innovation and creativity, looking at the plants we have and how can we fundamentally reduce the carbon footprint of them. So how can we, for example, electrify the heart of some of our plants? I mean, we literally refer to it as open heart surgery, and that's where we do need the expertise of partners. And Paul and Bechtel are helping us in Australia to do just that, where we will be doing that serial number one, I think, Paul, together. But then also importantly, in order to figure out how do we do that in other places. And then, Robert, the third part is I do think not everywhere, but in some places, we will be able to utilize the infrastructure also for some of these lower carbon gases. I think synthetic methane is a perfect example because we can actually generate the methane, starting from an electron and through hydrogen. You can then use a lot of the midstream and transportation infrastructure and even the end customer infrastructure, in the same way as that exists today for the LNG market, whilst putting a cleaner and more sustainable product through that infrastructure.
It's kind of building the value chains of tomorrow on top of the value chains that we have today in many ways. Well, Minister, let me come back to you and maybe ask you about something that Francois was talking about, which is this incredibly important need to collaborate with stakeholders and customers very early on, much sort of earlier than it used to be the case. How is that playing out in Trinidad and Tobago? And as you talk to potential customers, obviously with your partners, are you hearing more about things like ESG and methane mitigation and environmental considerations? Like, how has that changed now versus 5 or 10 years ago?
It has absolutely changed because it's become more of a priority global conversation. But I think this is a good opportunity for me to just kind of plug for a pet peeve of mine. One of the worst emitters that is adding so much harmful gas and carbon is coal. And we as the gas producers really have to push back on the coal, because if you begin to eliminate the use of coal in all of this production and manufacturing, etc., that is where the significant changes are going to be made in cleaning up the climate. So it really irks me at times, and one of the first things we had post the 24th of February last year, when Europe, for example, to pick on them unfairly, went into crisis and had to phase back from the use of Russian gas, is they cranked up every coal plant they possibly could. That must have led to more emissions. There were plants that were about to be decommissioned, they utilized them. I'm not hearing that as part of the conversation. So there's this targeting on gas, which is the cleanest source of energy. And when I look around, everything here has some element of gas in its production, whether it be through methanol and all of the plastics, etc. Now, to come to what you've asked me about specifically, we have had to evolve. I think we need to be, as I said at the opening, more nimble. So we're constantly listening. I mean, the conversations taking place in Trinidad, I was reflecting on it. I'm sure the people who were doing this 15, 20 years ago had a lot less contact because it was, yeah, go ahead with the project. And as you said, Francois, we see it as the plant and the pipeline are one. Once you've gotten the permission, go ahead. But now you have a lot more environmental scrutiny, etc. But you're also looking, how do you make the margins work for the private sector capital investments, whilst making sure you get good returns for the people that you represent out of their natural resources. So we are constantly in contact. So I can say as the minister in charge and responsible, almost on a weekly basis, I'm in contact with the major players, listening to them, listening to the complaints, but also listening to the public servants who are there to protect on the environmental regulatory framework. And I'm pushing back at them as well to say, look, you can't think how it was decades ago. The world has changed. So what you were thinking about decades ago, we need to move faster, we need to move quicker, because there's certain doors that can close on us if we're not a lot more nimble and attentive to the conversations, but you're still protecting. So there is a lot more collaboration. I believe when I think about the number of engagements that I have on a weekly basis with the stakeholders, and just to try and make things work, and going to cabinet, for example, and saying, look, we need to take a decision, and I'll give you a live example, where there's a commitment to drill a well in the south, but they've found gas in the north. I'm not going to force you to drill that well in the south, where there's less perspective, and next thing you don't hit what you need to do. So as a regulator, I listen to you and say, okay, we're willing to make the exception and go and drill your well in the north. And these are the types of things as a government and as a regulator, working with the stakeholders, that need to happen. And well, I'm sure Bechtel would have a very different experience today than they did when you were breaking ground with Train 1 years ago. I remember I was an attorney hired at the time to go and fight for the project to go ahead and to deal with the fence line communities and this type of thing. It's a very different conversation taking place. And as a government, I think you need to be nimble, you need to be attentive, you need to be listening, and be able to make sure that you meet the thresholds and requirements in a quicker time frame.
Yeah, and Paul, maybe I will sort of pick up where the minister left off there and say that, you know, he used terms like being nimble and emphasized collaboration. And also, I think Cederic was talking too about being nimble in the sense that one day the market's focused on energy security and the war in Ukraine and coal's coming back in Europe, and then we're back to ESG and climate concerns because COP28 is coming out. How does it look for Bechtel to sort of pivot and maintain this collaboration and be nimble at the same time in this kind of volatile world that we live in? I know that as an EP&C, you're a little bit further away from the downstream customer, but you're still part of that value chain.
I think as an industry, I'd characterize us all as professional pendulum swingers. We're not very good at keeping all the balls up in the air, but we can all get really, really focused on one of them when it becomes, you know, a bit of a crisis situation. Well, maybe just to sort of comment a little bit on, you know, the permitting, the regulatory environment. You know, we operate in a lot of jurisdictions all over the world, you know, and the fundamental basics of permitting are pretty much the same everywhere in how you assess baselines, and then how you assess, you know, the impacts of the new facility and the assets, both in the construction and the operation. But that's about where the similarities end. There are many jurisdictions which are not flexible. And in fact, when you can actually, you know, bring to bear new technologies and the like, which can actually reduce the impact, when you're forced to go all the way back to the beginning of the permitting process, then what we're actually doing is we're actually choking down on innovation, which is actually going to reduce overall net impacts. So it's not the same the world over. Some places it's different to others. That's certainly something I was going to get on my soapbox and have a bit of an appeal out here would be to recognize where there are nimble regulatory authorities. We're not asking for corner cutting. Correct. We're not asking for shortcuts. We're not asking to not be held accountable to what we say we're going to go do. But working in great partnerships with our customers, many of whom have incredible technical organizations that live to really embrace and implement technology. Let's not get punished for doing the right thing. In fact, let's get celebrated for it, because it can actually make all of us be more competitive. Because the reality is that as we move on in time, all this infrastructure is getting more expensive. Nothing's getting cheaper out there. And again, technology is going to unlock it, but technology is also going to unlock how we reduce the footprints, and then the regulated process needs to surround us and be really, really adaptive to that.
So the moral is come and work in Trinidad, right? Bring it to Trinidad.
Well, I think picking up on that a little bit more, Francois, I think you mentioned in your previous comments, the importance, the critical role of sort of low-cost, efficient capital raising, right, for your business. I think that's true for everybody here. But how is that being affected in today's world by the two things we've talked about here? One is sort of the elevation of sort of low-carbon considerations and ESG, and then two is what Paul was saying in terms of where there is regulatory inefficiency and delays. Like, how are those two trends affecting your ability to raise capital?
Well, again, I think...
And your customers, for that matter.
Yes, yeah. Indeed. Indeed. The standard, one of the standard that has never changed over the last many decades is our customers want us to deliver a transportation service at a predictable cost on a predictable timeline. And our job has been made that much more difficult by some of the challenges we have, but engaging with stakeholders in a successful manner is something that capital providers are spending more time assessing than they ever have in the past. I meet with, I do about 200 shareholder meetings a year. We raise about $10 billion, or we spend about $10 billion a year in capital, so being able to raise capital on an efficient basis is very important to us. So it's a community I spend a good deal of time with. And they are increasingly and acutely focused on not only the predictability of timelines, but also on the useful life of the infrastructure you're building. So we're doing a lot of educating around the 30 to 50 year life of every piece of infrastructure we put in, whether it's natural gas or elsewhere. And also, to Cederic's point, where infrastructure can be repurposed for a lower emitting form of energy. Those assets are not just the steel in the ground.
Correct.
The rights of way themselves are valuable. The regulatory relationships you have, the credibility you have with the regulators and stakeholders in terms of advancing the permitting process. And to Paul's point, where you've been, and the need for agility, policymakers are driving us towards significant emissions reductions by the end of this decade. And we will not achieve those goals if it takes 7 years to permit and put an asset into service.
Correct.
So where you've managed a right-of-way, we have about 20,000 kilometers of pipelines in Western Canada, where we've managed a right-of-way for decades, and we can repurpose that right-of-way for transportation of CO2 to be sequestered, or for hydrogen. Does there need to be the same timeline and level of regulatory scrutiny than for a greenfield project on a new right-of-way? So these are the conversations we're having with governments around trying to work with them to execute on the policy and strategies that they're trying to implement.
Right. Yeah, and I guess, Cederic, picking up on that, I like that focus on predictable costs and predictable timelines. I think that's true for all the members of the panel here today. And this idea that predictable cost and predictable timeline is sort of at risk, both from the sort of longer term uncertainty that Francois referred to about the life of these assets, but also about the uncertainty about permitting timelines. Now, we talk about LNG Canada, a lot of other projects in Shell's portfolio. Is there a way to sort of mitigate those risks with this kind of heavy front-end engagement with indigenous partnerships, community relationships, obviously governments and regulators and NGOs, whether it's LNG Canada or some other projects you've worked on? Like, how is Shell tackling that challenge? And are you seeing some results where good front-end work can reduce those risks that Francois was talking about?
Yeah, Robert. I think if, back to the topic of this panel, right? I mean, it is about partnership. And what does partnership mean? It is really about understanding. And that requires dialogue. And at the end of the day, we were reflecting on this before the start. At the end of the day, our business is still a people business. And everything that we do gets done by people, through people, decided by people. It's sure, we talk a lot about assets and technology and about capital and returns, but it's the people that still make it happen. If you look at, different industry analysts, still predict that we could have up to a 50% increase in demand for LNG by the end of this decade compared to where we are today, right? So, and that's a huge challenge that we need to meet. And, Paul talked about the timelines to do projects and things. And if we go the traditional way, we won't meet that, that demand that's out there in the market. And then, how else will that demand be met? Could well be in a lower carbon way if we don't get that together. Now, so the understanding and the dialogue leads to alignment, I think. And then when you have alignment, you might not have all the certainty, because I think it's not just about uncertainty, but it's about confidence. And it's about confidence that you have the same objectives, you're moving in the right direction, and that, if you do hit bumps in the roads, or if there's things where you have differences of opinion, that you'll find the way to work through that together. Whether that's local communities, such as First Nations, whether that's with governments, whether that's with other interested parties in society. I'll just give two examples. One, back to Trinidad. In order to unlock this next, kind of frontier of gas supply, it did require us to sit down with the government and address some of the things that I think the government was deeply unhappy with around some of the models that had been there from perhaps the first generation of things. And to say, okay, well, if the government needs to give us some of the confidence to put that investment in, there were certain things that the government needed also in terms of how the revenue model needed to be readdressed to ensure that there was a fair distribution. That's something, once we understood what both sides needed, we worked through that, and then I can say that the minister and his team were also very cognizant about what it requires for a private company to invest, and we found a good balance there. Another example from last year that I'll use is the build out of regas capacity in Europe. Places like Eemshaven in the Netherlands, Wilhelmshaven in Germany, completely new regas facilities that were put in place. The first one in 6 months and the second one in 9 months. And this is including full permitting processes and all consultations. And that's just because everybody was extremely aligned on one objective and one achievement and wanted to do that together. So I do think it's possible, but not only does it require that pre-engagement and pre-investment in people and in time, but also really having that one common objective that everybody's aligned on.
Rob,
Please,
can I
Francois.
add something? Yeah. Sorry, I just want to make one additional comment on that. Policymakers also need to trust that the project proponents have the capabilities to manage the issues on the ground. Because you're asking them for permits. They're hearing perspectives from a number of different constituencies. They want to see that you have an ability to partner effectively with indigenous rights holders, but also that you have very strong communication and issues management at a very, very local level. And it's that level of trust and track record of being able to manage those issues to help our policymakers advance policy direction in a way that will achieve the outcomes that we're all trying to get to here.
And I love that you've described that. And I think everyone would agree that that's actually a competency within the business model, right?
Yes.
That part of the innovation has been for governments and EP&C and midstream and developers to build up that capacity around communications and community engagement and indigenous partnerships, because governments are not just making decisions based on technical capacity and balance sheet, and this competency you mentioned has really become a lot more important. I think that's a great flag on that one. Minister, let me ask you a little bit, maybe you ventured the term nimble a few times, but also to think about what Cederic said in terms of alignment. When you think about aligning the various stakeholders not just the government in Trinidad, but obviously the local population, the local suppliers, the foreign investors, the customers. How does that process of alignment work in TNT?
The key phrase I heard just now is trust. It's all about relationships and building that trust. And I think that is what we've gotten right in Trinidad and Tobago over the last few years, because Cederic is right. We had a very, very difficult situation where there was a feeling that we had not gotten fair returns for a while because of what was negotiated years ago. We made a complaint about it, but then there was a lot of mutual respect and relationship building, and we sat down with the stakeholders, and we literally laid the cards out on the table on both sides, worked very hard to come up with a mutually acceptable solution. Nobody got all that they want, but coming out of that was the concept of trust. So you feel a lot more comfortable going on now. And I was speaking at a conference a few weeks ago in Miami, presenting a paper on Trinidad and Tobago and what it is we've done over the last 8 years. And people came up to me afterwards, which took me by surprise, and said, listen, we would like you to come and tell that story, for example, in other areas of the world, because there is this dichotomy between government, regulators, policymakers, and those on the other side of the table. And we don't seem to be able to get over the hurdle of understanding we want the same outcome, you know. How do we get there? And it really comes down to the basics of respecting each other, relating to each other properly, and building out that trust. And I think that's what we've spent a lot of time doing in Trinidad and Tobago over the last few years, going where we need to go to engage the stakeholders, being able to listen, because I hear exactly what you say, and that is the next frontier. So, okay, I have existing infrastructure, as Francois said, and now I want to use it, for example, for CCUS. These are pipelines I can use for that. Why are you putting me, the private sector, through the hurdles as though I'm starting from ground zero and from scratch? Let's find a compromise somewhere in there. You've seen how it's been used before. I have a permit to utilize it. It's now a new product that's going through it. And that's where I think governments and policymakers and regulators need to be able to listen and find ways. It doesn't mean that we bend over backwards or cut corners. Absolutely not. But working together with a trust element, I have seen that we've been able, I mean, Cederic may argue otherwise, that we've been able to shorten timelines and timeframes. But I'll just give you all one perspective. As a minister, it's not an easy task here either, because you're now dealing with people who are the public service, and they've done business a certain way for decades. And you now come in, and even there you have to build trust. Because they're saying, well, you're just a politician, and politicians don't, you know, they're always looking to cut corners, etc. But again, you sit down and you work it through, you put forward your perspective, and hopefully bring them, and once everybody's on the table, that's where things start to flow. And it's not an easy task by any means, but I think we've gotten it fairly right. We've moved the pendulum in Trinidad over the last few years, and I think we're swinging in the right way until it swings back, right?
Thank you, Minister. So Paul, Francois, and Cederic, as we're getting near the end of the session, I'm going to ask you all a question, and you can just kind of go one by one answering. And this is a tricky question, but I'm going to put you on the spot. I think, you know, hearing about the experience in Trinidad and Tobago and other countries, you know, all of your businesses work globally or across North America in Francois' cases. Which governments really have got this right? Right, the idea of balancing nimble and regulatory efficiency, and it's okay to say none, but is there a particular case study? Because we always hear what doesn't work, but are you seeing examples of projects, or maybe it's subnational jurisdictions, provincial, state, federal, that actually is sort of, besides Trinidad and Tobago, of course, governments that have sort of figured this out, how to provide that nimble, not cutting corners, but a more efficient model to respond to the kind of urgency that you mentioned, Cederic, with you know, Germany and Netherlands and approving regas in the crisis. So that's one example, but I'll throw that to the three of you. Are you seeing countries and regulators that have figured this out?
Who's going to jump on that one first?
I'll go first. I'll go first. I'm happy to answer that. I think all governments are learning. I'll start with Mexico. When the current administration came to office, they had a very confrontational view on the role of natural gas in Mexico. and how the energy reform had been established. Through very close and constructive dialogue with them, and I give this current administration a great deal of credit, they learned that affordable, reliable energy can help the country of Mexico achieve its socioeconomic goals and commensurately reduce emissions significantly, which they have demonstrated. I would say in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act is a demonstration of the power of the United States as the world's reserve currency to send a clear message to the world around its desire to lead around energy transition. And on my last visit to Washington, the words permitting reform were on the lips of every policymaker, whether on the left side or the right side of the aisle. And in Canada, I would say that the focus is also on how can Canada be competitive with the United States in developing greener infrastructure in the face of the Inflation Reduction Act. And understanding that you could put the fiscal health of the country at risk if you try and compete with the United States, but bringing forward the importance of permitting reform to be competitive. And it is, I would say, the degree of success of each country is bespoke to different regions of the country where there's a better understanding and acceptance, because consumer acceptance of a form of energy supply or of a piece of infrastructure has a significant impact on how governments behave. And in parts of the United States, it's very easy to permit infrastructure. In other parts, it's more challenging. And so there's a regional dynamic there that we all have to consider. So they are all learning. In my view, we're all grounded. We must all be grounded in what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, as Stuart mentioned. In my view, it is not to pick favorites among forms of energy supply. It's about reducing emissions. I'll be maybe somewhat controversial. I don't believe that Article 6 in the Paris Agreement is a very effective way to incent collaboration. It tolerates collaboration. It does not incent collaboration. We must collaborate, at least on a regional basis, what I see in North America, because to the extent energy transition is unorderly through lack of collaboration, we risk a policy shock, a developing market rejecting energy transition if the energy shocks are dramatic and if the cost increases are dramatic, as we saw in Germany and in Western Europe last year. So collaboration, in my view, is essential to achieving our outcomes. And the governments are all learning, and they're all beginning, in my view, to understand the importance of it.
Well, Francois, there's so many things to unpack there. I just think quickly, before we go to Paul and Cederic, that I appreciate what you said about Mexico and kind of learning from each other, which I think is really valuable in that process there. And also, seeing we're talking about innovative partnerships, the IRA really brings government in as a provider of capital,
Yes.
which is kind of a whole new world as well, which we could talk about maybe in another panel. Cederic, you gave a great example already with Germany, but any other thoughts?
Yeah, so Robert, I'm not going to be drawn out on one particular country because I think we work in strong partnerships with many countries. I think there's three elements, and this builds very much on what Francois said, that that helps this, and when governments are, as you say, perhaps learning or doing this the right way. One is engaging around, really the challenge of what this energy transition means, and not staying in kind of the easy statements or in the populist side of things, and that's where it starts. So being very clear on where the end game is, and I completely agree with Francois, it's about reducing those emissions, but also being very grounded in kind of what are the realities of today and what are the realities of, say the next years today. I think that's kind of number one. I think the second one is realizing that, at the end of the day, energy is a global environment and it's a global market. And that means that we have to have a global perspective around what does it mean in terms of emissions, and not just in one location, but also about what global competitiveness means. And then perhaps just a little bit, taking it closer to home here, is, what we often see is that we also run into challenges where different levels of government are not synchronized well. So you can take states versus federal, provinces versus federal, et cetera. And so really making that align, how different parts of the government all have, kind of one objective working together, that's when we get it right, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my former risk analyst days, that was always the question of the national government may be going one way, but the regional government may be going another, and the community and the other. So, Paul, do you want to answer this tough question as well?
Yeah, maybe I just share a couple of thoughts. Really good regulators are really good at listening. And regulatory assessment isn't done by bureaucrats sitting behind a desk in the Department of No. The really good regulators are the ones that listen to the communities in which we build and operate these assets, and the voice of those communities is really important. And the best projects that I've seen, and in jurisdictions, is where there is significant time and effort spent in face time, a lot of vulnerability with the community, addressing concerns, sincerely listening to the question, and making sure that the community in which we're going to go build these assets feel like they're going to get something which is a long-term benefit. So if I think about, in Bechtel, Cederic said it before, we're a people business. We deploy human capital to go build assets. One thing we have learned in the last couple of years, the construction population is declining.
Sure.
It's hard work. It's in hostile environments. You're away from home. We've got to enthuse kids and young people to come into construction. It's all I've done my entire life. I think it's the best career on the planet. One of the ways we do that is we develop this new infrastructure, as we modernize existing infrastructure, is enthusing the communities to welcome us, to embrace us, because that's what, again, is going to continue to unlock the pipeline of talent, which is, the people that are going to be in 10, 15, 20 years beyond all of us, continuing the journey on which we're on today, which is going to get us to that net zero.
Well, and workforce development is a whole other area of collaboration and innovation partnerships that I'm sure is a great interest to the audience as well. We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to offer everybody a chance for any final thoughts or closing remarks. We've talked about this idea of innovative partnerships from a lot of different perspectives, governments, industries, customers, capital markets, local communities. Any final thoughts from you, Minister?
Absolutely. I think one of the things I'd like to leave us with as we all get ready to depart from lovely Vancouver and head home wherever home is we need to advocate more. So you're talking about the engaging communities, and one of the things going through my mind is you're absolutely right. We're now living in a world of social media as well, which has made it tremendously more difficult because there is a lot of platform for fake news and misinformation and these types of things. And I think, especially in the LNG world, if we collaborate more on the advocacy and the messaging side, because I'm not seeing that globally. I'm not seeing the pushback from all of us who have the facts, who understand it, pushing back about some of the conversations that are taking place there. I absolutely agree with François and Cederic when they said it's all about reduction of emissions. There are ways that we can be applying technology, Paul. You were speaking about it earlier, to be able to reduce the emissions and to get rid of the harmful greenhouse gases. And I think it is incumbent upon us to really educate the global population about the benefits and the work that we're doing to be able to clean up. And I agree with you, sometimes people sit down in these rooms in Paris, for example, and they make these drastic statements and sign things. How realistic is it? And that's our job now, to deal with that. How do we get us there? It's one globe, and it's one globe we have to protect. And I think gas is an excellent platform going forward in the future. And one thing I'd like to leave us with is let's make sure that our voices are heard, because all I've heard is singing from the same hymn sheet. Thank you.
Paul, any final thoughts?
So I want to echo the point you made about in this transition, there's less of some things that we definitely need, like coal, and there's more of everything else that we do need and that we know how to go do that's capitally efficient, leverages technology, and is pushing forward cleaner energy. So we need more of that. We certainly need regulatory environments to embrace us on that journey. And we can't continue to get distracted by the lofty future state that's decades out in front of us, for that to be something which stymies us doing what we know how we can go do today to make existing infrastructure more efficient. You know, it's the net word, which is kind of like the clue in all this. It's not an absolute zero. Of course, that's what we want to get to at some point, but let's not let all of that constrain us to the point where we end up just vacillating and doing nothing.
Very true. Francois, final thought.
I would say my experience and observation over the last few years has been that all participants in the energy value chain legitimately want to reduce emissions and be part of the solution. I think the point Cederic made about a 1% interruption in natural gas supply creating a huge amount of volatility gets to the point around the scale of energy infrastructure, and that in order for us to manage energy transition in an orderly fashion, it will need to be very gradual, and this is where natural gas will play a huge role.
Cederic, the last word is yours.
Thanks, Robert. Two things I want to say in closing. One, I think this may well be the biggest challenge of our generation that we're talking about that, and I'm extremely inspired to be part of that. The one plea I would make to everybody, and that's in this room but beyond, is in the current society, people are becoming more and more polarized about everything. And if we stay polarized on this, we're not going to find the solutions. So I think we need to bring that together and to listen and to not just be on our standpoints. The last comment I want to make, and it's perhaps taking us back to some of the comments made on stage here on Monday as well, and because of partnership, I had the opportunity last night to be part of an event that was the inauguration of the High Sea WAMIs, which is a partnership between C-SPAN from here in Vancouver and the Haisla First Nation. And it was just such an energizing and powerful event, in terms of the energy that it brought in the partnership, and inaugurating the first electric powered tug that is going to be working in our industry. But just to see how a project like LNG Canada here in BC not only contributes to, kind of a cleaner energy system in Asia, how it not just contributes to more jobs for British Columbians and Canadians, but also how it contributes to, kind of economic and cultural reconciliation and improves the opportunities for First Nations. That's partnership in action, and it's happening right here.
I love the idea of partnership in action, and I also appreciate what you said about education and dialogue, and I'll put in a plug for my own center at Columbia University, Center on Global Energy Policy, where we're all about education and dialogue. So you're all welcome to come visit us in New York. Thank you very much, Minister Young, Paul Marsden, Franșois Poirier, Cederic Cremers. We really appreciate your discussion this morning. I think about the idea of partnership in action is a great place to leave it. So thanks very much to our panel this morning. And as you exit the stage, then we'll please remain in your seats, because we're going to go right into the next panel on the second part of innovation here as well. So thanks very much.